Welcome back, subscribers. This is what it's titled is Trust Fund Babies, and what my experience is with them. I just had a weekend where I went and visited my daughter, and one of the people that was in the party that was part of the get together. He's a young man who is he has a future that is not really solidified yet, and he, but he's going to be living on a trust fund, most probably. Like he's going to be taken care of, right? So he trust fund baby. So I've had a number of these because of my background in remodeling and housing and construction in general. That my client base was a higher level client, and when you start getting into larger elements of wealth, and that's why I talk about wealth from um, a realistic perspective, not somebody that grew up wealthy, but somebody that has worked for people that are wealthy. And it basically, I like to take away the good and leave the bad, because there is absolutely a pay the piper thing that happens with wealth, and it usually happens as the generations wear on. So the experience that I've had with people that are second and then third generation trust fund babies are they're totally disconnected to how any reality really works, and they have a hard time finding mates and people that they can have transactions with, and they because they can't relate and understand why it's difficult for other people, on a day-to-day basis, because they don't have to worry about money, and they can pay for services, and then they have automobile provided, and the insurance. Basically, your whole life is about monetary coverage. If you have a way to have it covered and paid for, and you don't have to be concerned with it, it's just one less thing that you have to be putting on your personal balance sheet to get through every month. And if you didn't have to worry about any of those, so trust funds, some there's like uber rich all the way down to maybe somebody's getting $500 or $1,000 or something, but still it's very helpful to somebody when you don't have it. And when we're looking, I didn't grow up that way, um, but if I had somebody that was throwing $1,000 or 10,000, whatever it is, whatever the number is, every single month, then my perception of you just take it off the table. It's just not ever of a concern. And but for everybody else, you're dealing with fending for all of that. I need 100% uh, of my capital resources are going towards sustaining whatever my lifestyle is. So they live in a totally unrealistic reality because they have everything provided for them. Maybe not everything, but you know what I mean. Like they're just it's an easier road, and they do things. I've never seen them on the young side. I've always typically seen them 30s and up in age. And this kid is 20, all right? And he doesn't yet have access to the trust fund, but he knows that he's basically essentially like taken care of, because I think his mother's father is like really wealthy. So he's going to be totally covered. So be like, well, what's he doing? Is he going to college? Be like, he's taking classes, but he's not really into anything. He's like, as far as having a career or something like that, it's like kind of not really on the table. He skateboards. He's in a couple of bands, that type of thing. He's just kind of like living, footloose and fancy free, like not a care in the world. And I think that's great. And that would be a very interesting way to be having existence as a human. I would just talk to another person that had an art exhibit. That's why we went up to Virginia this weekend. They had an exhibit that was at this art museum, and I was talking with him, and I said, I said, art's great. I said, whenever you have somebody else like paying your way, I said, there's a reason why they use the term starving artist. And I said that, if you're actually having to pay your bills on your art, I said, there starts to become a compromise, because you're going to do whatever the commissioned person or whoever's going to be buying it, whatever the market bears for you to produce it. You're not really free. You have no freedom for art to do whatever you want, because you have to pay your bills. I said that really the best space. I said that the real true artists are people that are um, they're like trust fund babies. I said that they have everything covered. They have nothing to worry about, and they can just go be free and do whatever they want to do. And And then that's their use. It's just production and put back in art. And you'll see this actually. It's pretty often in Hollywood and also in music in general that people that have the wealth and the resources and the backing are able to go do it. And it's and then it's free. But ultimately, is it the best art? And be like, well, it's subjective. Maybe the best artists are the ones that actually they don't have the funding. If you've noticed that, so anyway, it's just kind of the reality works. And I told him, I said, we have background in high level junior golf, like travel junior golf, like I wouldn't even call it pre collegiate. I would be like pre professional because you could go directly into professional essentially from this. So we were in that world and that lifestyle, and it was very difficult. Like you pay to get into a tournament, and we were around a number of other like trust fund baby, very wealthy people, but not everybody that's in that space is super wealthy. There were the people that just didn't work, and then they just flew around in their private jet and did only their children just did these tournaments. Um, so, but there were many of us that we're able to have access to it because the tournaments say would be an entry fee to be $250, and it's really the best person that wins. There's no judging, and that's why I really like that space with golf because it's the lowest score moves on. So it's really the best of the best. It's not a judging like art, where they have like somebody and they're gonna hook you up. It's like no. If you had a 3 on the hole, if you birdied it, you birdied it. That's it. There's no buying your way into a tournament. Um, so it was like kind of a way to level the playing field amongst people that are wealthy and then people that have access to networking environments. And I talk a lot about this in creating essentially like networks of people that are regular people that are just trying to get a little bit further along in their life, but they don't want to necessarily like be all in and be part of a secret society, or they don't come from wealth, etc. And whenever you're a single Pringle on your own and you're trying to become an entrepreneur, it's super duper difficult because you don't have any support. It's all on you. So you have to be the one that blazes the trail, does everything. And I'm just seeing this come through because of this kid that has future of trust fund payouts. So I spoke with his father. This guy, he's dating somebody that's in the family, not my children, but somebody that's in our extended family. And I spoke with his father like about a month or so ago, and my son, who's 19, and this kid is 20. The father was like really grilling me. The father's like asking me all these questions about like, well, how did your son get interested in what he's doing? And he's going to have a job in like 6 months, and he's going to be like working it on his own, and he's not going to live it. I was like, no, he doesn't. Yeah, and I kind of walked him through it. So because they had money, there was no real like stress and pressure to get the children out of the house. And this is a very interesting dynamic that comes into play with what I'm talking about, because I'm seeing Gen Zers that have the Gen X helicopter parents. Like a lot of Gen Xers, like a lot of us have money, and many of those people have basically put, I wouldn't say ruin the stock, but it's going to add to a very interesting dynamic, and that's what this is really about. A very interesting dynamic moving into the future on how these taken care of Gen Zoomers are going to be mixing into society, and how it's going to affect the social landscape of society, because everything had always been taken care of and provided for by the family. It's a different dynamic than what Gen X had, because our parents didn't give a shit about anything that we did. They might have had money, but we had to figure out how to make it work. I didn't grow up with that, but even kids that I grew up with that had parents that had businesses and had wealth, they were still having to go out and do things on their own. Whereas this kid, for example, everything is 100% taken care of, but he's not like a Hilton. It's not even close. So that's what I'm saying is like you're going to have like regular people that have leveled up, and they have money set aside correctly in this transference system through a trust, and how much money is just money and wealth has just increased in the United States, and now they're putting it away for future generations. But because the future generation knows they have this safety net, that they don't have any fire under their ass to go out and do anything, And because you have to be, a lot of the inspiration comes from need and necessity, right? You have to pay your bills, you need to have a car, etc. And that is that's a lot of motivation. But if you don't really have that and you don't have the need, then again, like it's an experiment. Like what's going to happen in the next 20 years when these Zoomer, trust fund babies actually get permeated into society, because they are not of the I don't know. They're not going to be going to Milan, or they're yachting, or automobiles. They don't really have a thing that has a high value that they're interested in, because they're like, that was the older generations had that, so they don't have the. I'm talking about the mid-level, not rich people that like worked regular jobs, and then they're helicopter parents. These are Gen Xers, and then they have children, and then everything is like taken care of, and because they've followed and done everything to a T, inside the their family monetary system, right? Just setting something up as a trust and taking care of their children. Whereas the greatest generation, World War II generation, didn't necessarily do that, because they were like working class, blue collar. Most of them were like, that's what I'm saying. Like regular working class has shifted from blue collar factory workers back in the greatest generation, World War II generation, into the Gen X generation, where blue collar is actually turned into academic degrees. So like everybody had a freaking degree. Everybody went to college. So yeah, that's going to be a very interesting dynamic. So they're more educated but ultimately they're doing the same things. But they live better lifestyles. But they're doing the same things. But their children and their offspring are going to be of that normal. They're going to public school, and they're doing their normal everyday things, and maybe maybe they work a job or something like that at fast food place, something like that. Where they're just being like kind of a regular kid. So it's going to be very interesting to see how, because of that ease and that structure, goes into this Zoomer generation trust fund, where everything has been to a T laid out for them. So that's what I'm saying. Like the greatest generation, the World War II generation, would have influenced and taken care of the boomers, then the Gen X, and so on and so on. So it usually skips about a generation or so. Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting moving forward. And at any rate, what I'm saying is like, what skills do they bring to the table? I just saw a report today from Pepperdine University saying that there's a lot of students that are coming into their college that can't read. It's like, ooh, that's a problem. Maybe it's not. But yeah, this is a very interesting dynamic where you have regular people, which would be like the evolution of the blue collar, regular everyday people, which are now educated people, which then work, 9 to 5, work in a cubicle, or an administrative office, or work for the government or something like that. That they work in an office type setting, and then they've stowed things away and done everything like what you're supposed to do, and then they're sitting on a pretty decent nest egg where they can, when it's handed over to the next generation, their children, that the children don't really have to do much of anything, because then they're just running on compound interest. And as this is part of the perspective of why I've been seeing this for years and being like, well, this is kind of a big problem, because this can't continue on, because you're basically going to have society that isn't able to take care of itself. There's a movie, the Time Machine, not the newer one, the old one that's in black and white, the movie The Time Machine. And he goes back in time, and he finds out, like when he finally finishes out, that that it seems like that they're in this like when I think that, what are they called? Monarchs? No, Molochs. Maybe they're called Molochs. Are they called Molochs? I have to rewatch the movie. Moloch is I don't need to get into that right now. But there's two factions, and one faction, they basically like, it looks like it's like bliss, and but they don't really do anything. They don't really have any skills. They don't have any survival skills. If somebody's drowning, they just let them, like, they don't really go and try to save them. They're just like a complete disintegration of society based upon the guy that goes back in time, of how things are at the time he's in, and then he goes back in time and things have totally changed. So I was like, yeah, this is going to be very interesting. Like moving forward, like if you could come back in like a couple hundred years and then see how this social change of how the having things provided and not ever having to worry about them and moving that into social society, having them have children and so on and so on and so on, and be like, yeah, that sounds like a really good way to destroy a society. I'm like, well, maybe, maybe not. I'm like, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be sustainable. You're right. So there's these ebbs and flows of society, and you can just kind of see how it's deteriorating. So the more wealthy and things that come easy for people, it creates weaker generations, and then whenever things get actually really difficult, it either the ones that can handle it step up and the stars shine, and then the other ones just fade away, and that's basically the way everything is. Um, so yeah. Anyway, I just something that I just noticed this weekend, and asking questions back and forth, like what are you going to be doing? What are your plans? Like 25, 30? Like you're already behind. You're 20 years old, and you don't really have you don't have any education. You're just like skateboarding, drinking. Just like partying up, you know, doing your band stuff. Like that's like the primary focus. And like, is that really the career? Is that going to be like, or do you want to have a family? Do you even think about that? Do you just wait till you're older? Um, I don't know. For somebody like me that was always very driven, it's interesting to see how somebody else's mind works and like what got them to the point to not really think about any of it because it's all taken care of. And I'm like, well, I know that it was like part of my life that I wanted to get these things out of the way, whether it was education, business, working, moving forward, etc. So I was always very driven. So I had goals and things that I want to get to. And if you had it all taken care of and you had nothing, lighting a fire under your ass, then when would you ever, like, at what point would you wake up to the fact, like, oh, I need to, like, if the money runs out, what are you going to do? And I think that we're at that point essentially. Like, and my point to this is, I think the United States is in exactly that same dynamic. Like if you took it and went the story I'm telling you about the trust fund babies just on a single level, just people in general, that would be the micro level. And then if you like blow it up and go to the macro level, that would be the United States in general. Like if you look at it as a country and how wealthy the United States is relative to other countries of the world. So it's like the entire of the United States is running like it's a trust fund baby, basically, relative to the other countries of the world. And whenever that happens, that's I said, it degrades and falls apart because more and more and more things are taken away from society because people don't know how to do anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you blame it on your Washington and big business, moving jobs overseas and no manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And be like, no, 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 no. It's just there isn't any one single thing that's causing it, but because this is a natural frequency switchover that's occurring. So it's like if you looked at it from a pullback perspective, we're going into the fall of the society in the United States of what we know of. Does that mean it's going to be like our generation is going to see it and be like, probably not, but it's similar. Like if you think about it, like as the day, how the day, like in the morning, right? You have the spring as the sun just crests the horizon. So that would be like say the creation of the United States. It's just coming in. It's just the lights coming in, and then full sun would have been at the peak, which I don't know really when the peak of the United States would have been. Maybe after World War II, like maybe the 50s to the 90s, something like that. And then what happens is like whenever it starts, you've hit the peak of the day, and it's just imagine like a regular day with the sun out, and it's high noon, and then 12 to 1 o'clock. You don't really notice any difference. It's pretty much all the same, right? So that might be representative, like the 80s to 90s economically, and then the fall started around the 2001 Space Odyssey, Twin Tower thing. So that would have been whenever you at that hinge point where you're right at that node point between, like, I'm noticing that it's full sun, but I'm noticing the sun is lower in the sky and it's waning. So that would be the Space Odyssey date. And then And then we have another 30 years after that. So now when it becomes apparent that the light of the day is waning, that's whenever things start to get real. When the realization, like, we're running out of daylight. You've heard that saying before. If you've ever been on a hike or something and you need to get back and you have no light, and you're like, and you've ever had to use the sun, and you're like, we're running out of daylight. We've got another 4 miles to go. We're going to have to pick up the pace. We can't be in here in the dark. It's like that. So that realization, that's the seriousness of a moment of, in my opinion, that is the most serious of whenever you come to the realization that, in fact, yes, you're running out of daylight and that you need to step up, right? And that's where, when these trust fund babies, it happens, typically it's like when they come to the realization and they wake up, where everybody else around them is like, all right, dude, like, we're working jobs and we're responsible for ourselves and taking care of our things. We woke up a long time ago and grew up, and you're just going to keep doing this bullshit because you can. Be like, so they have absolutely no reason to kind of wake up to the fact. So in the United States, like, as far as the economic system in general, that's where I see us at currently. Is like, it's not the end, like, of darkness. It's at the moment of the realization, like, we got an effing problem here, and everybody has been talking about it. But if you look at it from how much time do I got, Danny? Is this going to happen overnight? It's going to be a systemic, slow procession down until it comes back on the other side. So then you've got, well, does that mean that there's going to be, if it's 30 years going in, be like, don't even worry about any of that. So it's just knowing that whenever the realization kicks in and people start realizing that the United States is losing its market share, and it's going to become um, evident to all of the citizens, by the time that becomes evident, then it will have already happened in the markets. The markets already respond preemptively to that. So that's what I'm saying, is like, we're at a very close hinge point to this, and that's also where it's coinciding with this great reset, and also some of the other work that I've done, looking at digital identifications, ESG, etc. So we look at all these different data points, and I'm like, yeah, if I'm putting this in perspective on a way that I can, have uh, equate it to something else, it would be as if you're not at that point where you're not in full sun, you're not sun setting, you're at that point where someone comes to the realization that you have less daylight than you had before. I say, so whenever that happens, that's whenever the shit hits the fan, is what I'm trying to say. That's when it gets serious. So we're right at the cusp of that. I'm anticipating, based upon the digital identification, some of the other stuff I know. I've talked about this before. Just as, like, and again, it's like, it's rough prognostication, but based upon all the data that we're looking at, um, the the energy doesn't turn over into the new space of one of these node points. Like, essentially, it's like almost like a magnet that's flipping, poles. That's essentially what happens, where you could delineate from, like, this is the old way and this is the new way, right? And we kind of had like a brief blip of that in 2020, and then things kind of went back to normal, sort of, basically. But we're going to be in a totally different space. There's going to be some different weightings on how things are um, applied to regular everyday business. And those are the things that we're going to be talking about, because there's a lot of opportunity there, because as these things change moving forward, and the new rules of how business is done, if you have the agility to be able to move into those new spaces, then you're going to be in a lot better shape than a lot of other people. People that don't have that kind of neuroplasticity to move into these new spaces are going to just be left to the wayside. All right, they're going to be, left in the woods, pissing in their boots, because they can't figure out a way to, blaze a trail to get the hell out of there. So anyway, those are the things that we talk about in the reservoir, and it's just something that I kind of, I have this always kind of running in my my background. It's like it's running on simmer. My background in my mind. And then when I have experiences with people just in everyday life, and I ask them questions of what they're seeing, of what they're doing in the future, um, I get this sense that the Zoomer generation, the Gen Zers, the reason why that they've taken the education away, and they've taken, they can't read, they can't write, they're not really doing anything. They're taken care of because of Gen Xers, so on and so on. That because they're going into a new space that Z's the last letter in the alphabet, and then you have generation alpha and then generation beta. So that means you're starting anew. You're starting the alphabet all over again. Do you see? So it's as if it's like, well, if you're a Gen Zer, like it's not really necessary for you to know, have education and all these other stories and histories and things like that, because we're going to be changing all of it. You know, I'm not, but I'm just saying like society in general. And that certainly seems to be the case. Like, why would you teach anybody? And how easy it would be to change civil society and the way things run is if you don't teach any of them. So that's another tell that says, like, well, if they were actually teaching the younger generations histories and how to do math, read and write, and just simple things that we all learned, um, if you were, then it would be harder to discern this flip over and this reset that's happening. But if you don't teach them, then it would be like, well, that makes sense. Be like, well, by the time Gen Alpha comes into play in the next 20 years, the Gen Zers, they're not going to resist, because Gen Alpha is going to be like emerging out of the ashes and saying like, hey guys, we got this. Thanks for playing. And then the Gen Z trust fund babies will be like, well, we can't do anything anyway, so we're just going to do what the alpha and the betas are doing. So also alpha male, strongest. So there's so many, uh, you know, there's a lot of energy that's behind it based on language and what it actually means. So it's identifying this kind of like switch and turnover. So for me, it'd be like, hey, Danny, what are you doing as a Gen Xer? I'd be like, well, I'm just going to be surfing this shit, because just like all the other, and again, that's Gen X. So we've had so much shit that's been thrown at us, and be like, well, like it's another thing, like it's going to really fucking matter. Be like, yeah, who cares? Like just because the system is changing and I have new requirements and things like that doesn't mean that I can't do it. So it's not a deterrent for me. So um, at any rate, so that's what we do here, and we talk about things that are emerging and changing as they go, but we're not hanging on to the old system. I'm like done with that. There's so much energy, and there's so many things that are showing to me that things are going to be turning over into this new system. And for a lot of people that don't understand any of it, they get really scared. So we look at it from a direct nuts and bolts, and also give kind of like a timing, like me saying like, hey, digital ID is gonna be critical mass in 2028 to 2029 range. We'll say the year 2028. So then that means that in order to justify this, why they were going to have that in the first place, then you're probably looking at market disruptions beforehand, because the digital identification is directly tied into universal basic income. So you can't have universal basic income until you have the digital identification. Why would you have to have critical mass of digital identification before you would, the market would wreck and reset. So we're right in that moment. So halfway 26. So yeah, I think, again, by the fall, this is always very symbolic. So we're looking at most probably the fall is going to be like this major market disruption. And then we'll continue to be beaten down for like about the next year. And then digital identification, things like that would probably fall suit like afterwards. And then a solution afterwards would be, universal basic income, etc. But it might even happen next year. I I don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball. It's essentially like it's looming, and it's like as we keep marching closer to it, it's just like this. It's like a pressure cooker, and ultimately, the closer it gets, it's more explosive towards the event. So, at any rate, it's speculatory, but we're seeing a lot of points that lead to this as being uh, an inevitable thing. And I said that there's the trust fund babies are the Gen X, specifically trust fund baby energy is very interesting to me. So anyway, I'm going to cut you off here. I'll talk to you later. Cheers.